Welcome to the Wrath of Ravage.
There's a war going on outside, no man is safe from. You can run, but you can't hide forever.
Testing. Coronavirus was identified in 1965 as one of the first infectious replicatable viral models that could be used to modify a series of other experiences of the human condition. It was isolated once upon a time associated with the common cold. But what's particularly interesting about its isolation in 1965 was that it was immediately identified as a pathogen that could be used and modified for a whole host of reasons. And you heard me correctly, that was 1965. And by the way, these slides are public domain. You're welcome to look at every single reference. Every comment that I made is based on published material, so do make sure that you look at those references. But in 1966, the very first COV coronavirus model was used as a transatlantic biological experiment in human manipulation. And you heard the date, 1966. I hope you're getting the point of what I'm saying. This is not an overnight thing. This is actually something that's been long in the making. A year before I was born, we had the first transatlantic coronavirus data sharing experiment between the United States and the United Kingdom. And in 1967, the year I was born, we did the first human trials on inoculating people with modified coronavirus. Isn't that amazing? 56 years ago, the overnight success of a pathogen that's been 56 years in engineering. And I want that to chill with all of you. Where were we when we actually allowed, in violation of biological and chemical weapons treaties, where were we as a human civilization when we thought it was an acceptable thing to do to take a pathogen for the United States and infect the world with it? Where was that conversation? And what should have been that conversation in 1967? That conversation wasn't had. Ironically, the common cold was turned into a chimera in the 1970s. And in 1975, 1976, and 1977, we started figuring out how to modify coronavirus by putting it into different animals, pigs and dogs. And not surprisingly, by the time we got to 1990, we found out that coronavirus as an infectious agent was an industrial problem for two primary industries, the industries of dogs and pigs. Dog breeders and pigs found that coronavirus created gastrointestinal problems, and that became the basis for Pfizer's first spike protein vaccine patent, filed, are you ready for this, in 1990. Did you hear what I just said? 1990. Operation Warp Speed? I'm sorry. Where's the warp and the speed? Pfizer, 1990, the very first spike protein vaccine for coronavirus. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't it fascinating that we were told that, well, the spike protein is a new thing. We just found out that that's the problem. No. As a matter of fact, we didn't just find out it was not just now the problem. We found that out in 1990 and filed the first patents on vaccines in 1990 for the spike protein of coronavirus. And who would have thought? Pfizer. Clearly the innocent organization that does nothing but promote human health. Clearly Pfizer. The organization that has not bought the votes in this chamber and in every chamber of every government around the world. Not that Pfizer. Certainly they wouldn't have had anything to do with this. But oh yes, they did. And in 1990, they found out that there was a problem with vaccines. They did.
Me to find the CEO of Pfizer. We'll get the CEO of Pfizer next.
Didn't work. You know why they didn't work?
That man responsible for a lot of bodies. That's a lot of bodies. I'm just putting it out there. Hey, somebody need to step up to the plate.
It turns out that coronavirus is a very malleable model. It transforms and it changes and it mutates over time. As a matter of fact, every publication on vaccines for coronavirus from 1990 until 2018, every single publication concluded that coronavirus escapes the vaccine impulse because it modifies and mutates too quickly for vaccines to be effective. And since 1990 to 2018, that is the published science, ladies and gentlemen. That's following the science. Following the science is their own indictment of their own programs that said it doesn't work. And there are thousands of publications to that effect, not a few hundred, and not paid for by pharmaceutical companies. These are publications that are independent scientific research that shows unequivocally, including efforts of the chimera modifications made by Ralph Baric in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. All of them show vaccines do not work on coronavirus. That's the science. And that science has never been disputed. But then we had an interesting development in 2002. And this date is most important. Because in 2002, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill patented, and I quote, an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Listen to those words, infectious replication defective. What does that phrase actually mean? For those of you not familiar with language, let me unpack it for you. Infectious replication defective means a weapon. It means something meant to target an individual, but not have collateral damage to other individuals. That's what infectious replication defective means. And that patent was filed in 2002 on work funded by NIAID's Anthony Fauci from 1999 to 2002, and that work, patented at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, mysteriously preceded SARS 1.0 by a year. Dave, are you suggesting that SARS 1.0 wasn't from a wet market in Wuhan? Are you suggesting it might have come from a laboratory in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill? No, I'm not suggesting it. I'm telling you that's the facts. We engineered SARS.
I'm gonna go there.
SARS is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. The naturally occurring phenomenon is called the common cold. It's called influenza-like illness. It's called gastroenteritis. That's the naturally occurring coronavirus. SARS is the research developed by humans weaponizing a life system model to actually attack human beings. And they patented it in 2002. And in 2003.
Okay, so
The infamous Ralph Baric speaks on virology.
now we're back into infectious diseases. Here we are. It's the number.
And here is your Ralph Baric of UNC Chapel. He's going to be talking about infectious diseases and SARS-CoV.
One threat, and from my perspective, so since I've been on the planet, there's been a epidemic virus every decade, starting with Asian flu in 1957, Hong Kong in 1967 or 68. H1N1 came back in the 70s, followed by HIV, followed by West Nile, and then we got to the 21st century. And things sped up. SARS was the first epidemic virus of the 21st century, about 8,000 cases in 33 countries with a 10% mortality. Chikungunya virus emerged around 2005 and sort of slowly spread across Asian to Polynesian islands and then arrived in the Americas, where it caused a huge outbreak. Millions of people were involved in 2015. It's still here today. The Mexican flu in 2009 caused 220,000 deaths worldwide.
So before I continue, just to give a little bit of better understanding, SARS-CoV virus is a naturally occurring virus in nature. But what the government has done is created a synthetic version in the laboratory, then released it upon animal, then it grew stronger in that sense, the human contact upon animal.
MERS coronavirus emerged in 2012. It's still around today with a 36% mortality and about 2,200 cases. About the same time, H7N9 emerged in Southeast Asia with about 1,600 cases with 39% mortality. It's still around today, followed by Ebola with about 30,000 cases and a 39% mortality. And then Zika virus sort of drifted across Asia, ended up in Polynesia, and then arrived in the New World to cause another huge pandemic with the major complications being microcephaly and CNS development problems in infants and developing children. So if you look at virus families, clearly influenza and coronaviruses and flaviviruses are the three most predominant groups that are causing problems in the 21st century, followed by alpha viruses. Because I predominantly study coronaviruses and hate being behind flu, I include swine. And so there's 4 more big pandemics of swine. So clearly the most dangerous viruses on the planet are coronaviruses. I had to say that, Adolfo. Yeah, I know, but I'm a coronavirologist, and so I'm not talking about flu. Yeah. To mention I have high insecurity.
So he specifically studies corona. He's a virologist.
Levels about flu virology. I feel like a second-class citizen. Nah.
He get happy about this stuff. I'm pretty sure he knows more about the topic, and he can converse on a public level.
Based on that data, I think it's clearly number one. If you don't believe me, you can believe Bill Gates. He clearly thinks that 10 million people could easily be killed in the next decade or so from infectious diseases.
Bill Gates. I should do a video about Bill Gates.
So things like SARS disappeared after 2004. Ebola disappeared. Zika virus has almost disappeared. So are these viruses actually extinct, or are they just hiding? We've actually asked that question with SARS. These are, again, between 2002 and 2004. These are the viruses associated with the expanding SARS epidemic. Most of them are gone. In fact, all of them are gone. We can't find these viruses anymore. But when you sequence bats, these are horseshoe bats, and this is a bat that wants to bite whoever's handling it, you find all sorts of SARS-like viruses. In fact, these are up to 97% identical to these epidemic strains that caused human disease. So do they have potential? So that's the question that we were interested in. And so what we did was the spike glycoprotein gene right here mediates species specificity. You can actually remove that spike gene from these epidemic strains and put in these bat spike genes in place of them. This was done by Vineet Manecheri and other people in the lab. And of the 5 that we dropped in being almost identical to very, very different, 3 of them could actually replicate just fine and use human receptors for entry. If you took primary human airway epithelial cells that are removed from the conducting airways from transplant recipients, the lung they gave up, not the lung they received. So they take on the architecture of the human lung. SARS loves to replicate in these little cells that have cilia sticking out of them, and these viruses grow in those cells as well as the epidemic strains.
That's great.
And you can do a variety of experiments to try to get an idea of their pre-pandemic potential. So they replicate in the right cells, and they replicate exceptionally well. If this mouse, the parental strain is virulent, and you drop these bat strain genes in, they attenuate virulence. That's good news. But if you take a mouse that has the human receptor in it instead of the mouse receptor, these viruses are lethal. So they clearly have the potential to cause lethal disease. If you take vaccines against SARS that work against SARS, they don't work against these variants that are sitting in the animal pools, zoonotic pools, and therapeutic antibodies that are present that work against SARS don't work as well against the more distant strains. So the answer is there's still lots of pre-epidemic viruses around. This is the SARS story, but you can go to flu or any other virus that has emerging potential that pops up, causes an outbreak, and then disappears. It's still here. They don't go extinct. They are waiting to return. In fact, people that live around the caves where these bats hang out with these viruses actually are seropositive, and many of them who are seropositive have neutralizing antibodies. So they're being exposed. The virus is spilling over. It will happen again. So we can go to our panic-o-meter. This is an important thing. What kind of person will you see on the news that will raise your tension level and cause panic? This is by field, so clearly these guys don't cause much panic. But down at this end, as you can tell, astronomers, volcanologists, and virologists are the ones that cause all the panic on TV. So I think the virologists can probably do better. I think the astronomers are doing a better job of scaring people than the virologists.
It's weak for him to put that in his slide. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I'm sure on the meter, virologists, and because they can introduce things into society that's not natural. I wouldn't be surprised that he doesn't have. I would be surprised if he doesn't have a government. You know what I'm saying? Let's continue, but it just we'll put that in there. I guess. What does that have to do with his presentation? It just shows you that they've been studying what humanity responds to certain things, and trust me, they study. The government studies so-called black people more than any other race, and you will wonder why. Let's continue.
Just are doing, but virologists actually, there is a real threat. So, can we learn anything about past and current pandemics in terms of their severity to give us an idea of how bad the next one can be? Let's look historically. Well, we have the Black Death, 75 million people in Europe over about a 300, 400 year period of time. The Spanish flu that we're talking about today with 50 to 100 million deaths. HIV AIDS in 37 years has killed 1 million people plus a year. 35 million are infected, devastating disease. Smallpox during the Antonian Plague, I think this was during the Byzantine Empire, 20 to 30% mortality. In adults, 80% of the children died. In fact, although it's rarely mentioned, smallpox killed more people in the 20th century than any other pathogen, 300 to 500 million before it was eradicated. The greatest public health success stories in the history of the planet.
You will be a fool. That's one of my favorite phrases. You will be a fool. The government isn't continuously researching and trying to discover new ways to infect humanity in some way to fulfill their depopulation agenda. Now, why would if you compare it with biblical terms, you could see the similarities with how history tends to start over. Every now and then, the world starts over, and a majority of people get wiped out. And I feel like the government is trying to create, but it's not going to be a natural occurrence. It's going to be a man-made occurrence, so to speak. In history, great resets have happened, but I feel like when we force it to happen, that's going to be the end. It's going to be a lot of people will go extinct because they planted something. Trust me, especially with all the stuff that's going on today's days, shit crazy.
TV, 1.3 to 1.7.
Let me show you something else. Barrick was named in different conspiracy theories after 2015 paper he co-authored with many other scientists, including one associated with the Wuhan, which showed that coronavirus in bats could directly infect humans rather than evolving in another animal first. Theory that emerged about origins of COVID-19 was that it first appeared in a bat from a wet market in China. In 2021, Barrick signed on to an open letter that appeared in Science demanding an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. That same year, U.S. Senator Rand Paul also pointed the finger at Barrick at a congressional hearing. For years, Dr. Ralph Barrick, a virologist in the U.S., has been collaborating with Dr. Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Virology Institute, sharing his discoveries about how to create superviruses, Paul said. This gain of function research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health. The implication was clear. Intentionally, unwittingly, Eric was complicit in the creation of SARS-CoV-2. Now, the real question is, what's in this stuff? You know, as many experiments the government has done on humanity, and as many operations have been done in the shadows, you never know what's up these people's sleeve, so to speak. There's a thing called nanotechnology, and stuff that you can't see
With the naked eye.
You know what I'm saying? And I feel it's something to do with interrupting our frequencies through some sort of nanotechnology that humanity doesn't have the knowledge of yet. It's technology that's private and kept away from the public. But it's an article I just wanted to read on behalf of science.org. Further evidence supports controversial claim the SARS-CoV-2 gene can integrate with human DNA. A team of prominent scientists has doubled down on its controversial hypothesis that genetic bits of the pandemic coronavirus can integrate into our chromosomes and stick around long after the infection is over. If they are right, skeptics have argued that their results are likely lab artifacts. The insertions could explain the rare finding that people can recover from COVID-19 but test positive for SARS-CoV-2 again months later, basically saying that the vaccine doesn't work. Stem cell biologist Rudolph Janick and gene regulation specialist Richard Young of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who led the work, triggered a Twitter storm in December 2020 when their team first presented the idea in a preprint on BioRxiv.com. The researchers emphasized the viral integration did not mean people who recovered from COVID-19 remained infectious, but critics charged them with stoking unfounded fears that COVID-19 vaccines based on messenger RNA might somehow alter human DNA. Janish and Young stressed that their results, both original and new, in no way implied that those vaccines integrate their sequences into our DNA, but they don't know it. They just found out, they discovered something. They still have more looking into it, you know. They don't know for sure, pretty much. Go over there and read it if you want to. I just wanted to show y'all a few things. Alright, we are on a government website. No, they gonna always call these things conspiracy theories, but really it's not what they are. It's just a term that they created to make certain people believe it's just something made up. On the surface, bioweapons are natural disease outbreaks. On the surface, similarities exist between bioweapons and viral pandemics that may have allowed this conspiracy to seem plausible. As non-conventional non-kinetic weapons of mass destruction, bioweapons can create the same havoc as pandemics. As with the pandemic, if a bioweapon attack spreads widely, healthcare systems could be overwhelmed, perpetuating societal panic, as well as frustration, despair, psychological casualties among healthcare workers, adding to the panic. This cycle would only change when the pathogen weakens or natural immunity is strengthened. Natural outbreaks and bioweapons can affect animal populations in ways similar to that for humans. Certain bioweapons, animals stricken with disease, help identify exposure risks to humans so much that the authors employ public health officials to transition from passive to active surveillance of animal populations for biosecurity. Throughout history, viral agents
have been studied for use as weapons of disease.